He says, Jesus, yeah, I get what the teaching is, but who do you find as my neighbor? And Jesus then uses that to jump into the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he says, I'm going to change your definition of what it means to be a neighbor. You see, prior to this, they kind of had this idea that our neighbor is someone who, if we scratch their back, they can scratch ours. I'm going to love people who are my family because they're going to reciprocate the love in return. But Jesus comes and says, you know what? Sometimes our neighbors don't think like us. Sometimes our neighbors don't look like us. They don't talk like us. They don't vote like us. And sometimes they don't even believe like us. But it doesn't remove this command that we're supposed to love them anyway. The command to love our neighbor is open to everybody. And the teacher of the law says, I want to justify myself because my behavior is, I love people who look a lot like me and who believe a lot like me. And so Jesus, I want to justify my behavior. So he asked this question, well then who is my neighbor, in an effort to justify himself? My fear right now is that we, especially within the American Christian culture, we have a tendency to want to justify ourselves. And so we choose to love and to agree with people who look like us and talk like us and think like us and vote like us and believe like us. And there's this divisiveness that is happening in our country right now, where we hit on some particular topics that are really important and essential. And I'm not saying that there's an easy answer to any of these discussions. But what's happening in this political climate that we have is if I don't agree with you, the natural tendency is to think that we are enemies, that we're against each other. And there's not an open ability for us to have a discussion about these particular topics, because if we don't agree on some of these things, then love isn't even part of the equation. And Jesus says we're supposed to love regardless of those things. And so today we're going to do something that's entirely different, because my fear is that what each side is doing when there's this political divide, what each side is doing in an effort to justify themselves, they're figuring out, where do I fall politically? Where do I fall when it comes to some of these bigger ideas that seem to divide our country? Let me figure out where my party resides. Let me figure out what they're saying. And now let me go find a couple of verses in the Bible. And by the way, both sides are doing this. It's called proof texting. Let me figure out what I believe. And now let me go find a verse that justifies, which is what this guy's trying to do. Let me go find a verse that justifies where I fall. And in an effort, the world's looking at it. And they're saying, I'm frustrated by the church. And there's times I understand that. But the more frustrated we become with the kind of the church response to some of these topics, the more enamored we become with Jesus. Because Jesus often zigged when people expected him to zag. And so today we're going to begin a 4-week discussion that I think is going to be, if we do this right, it could be groundbreaking not just for our church, but our community, to say we have to have a dialogue. So over the next 4 weeks, a lot of this is going to look like a dialogue. And we're going to tackle some of these topics because I believe it can not just revolutionize our church, but if we do it right, it could change our community.